Okay, good morning, and thank you for joining us in the Conflict Consortium virtual workshop. We're delighted to have Jan Lupu with us, and Ann Clark, Amanda Murdie, Keith Schnakenberg, and Ryan Welch are going to be offering comments. Christian, unfortunately, can't be with us today, and Ann is going to get us started. So I'll turn it over to
Yeah.
Ann.
Well, thanks. I appreciate being invited to join you all. And hello, Jan. I don't know if we've met in person. Um, I thought this was a really thought-provoking and interesting piece. And I really had just three questions, which you've probably dealt with or thought about already. And well, actually, that might be four. And as I was reading, I noticed that you referred to a piece by Pai and Berlin and co-authors about kind of the dynamics of repression, and I had hoped to get a look at that before today's meeting, but I wasn't able to. Um, and so some of my questions actually relate to another piece that he wrote with George Lopez quite some time ago about the ideological components of repression. And it's really a question about modeling the process as one of rationality versus ideological commitment, and whether modeling the rational part is, and how actors calculate whether they'll be held accountable, is that close enough to what probably happens in a much more complicated way to give you adequate results? Because my understanding from case studies I've read is that often um, people who repress and people who are in institutions that repress do very unrational things, um, and they may be committed beyond what a ordinary rational person might um, decide to do. So that's one thing: is the rational model parallel enough that it can give um, accurate kind of results? And that's obviously an empirical question. The other question is that I felt like your model depended heavily on a certain conceptualization of the repressive period as one that's in response to protest and may come towards the end of a series of policy actions by the leader. And the kinds of situations I'm most familiar with, some of the classic cases in Latin America, for example, a lot of those are coups where the killing, torture, repression, disappearances takes place really quickly to eliminate protest at the beginning, and that actually enables repression to dissipate because there's not as much protest anymore. So I guess it's partly a question about the scope of the argument. And it may be that, I guess what I'd like to see is some discussion of what kinds of situations or scenarios do you see this as being best at talking about? Because that was really a big question that was raised in my mind. Um, do you have plans to test the model? I'm sure you do. So that's the third question. The fourth one is more about advocacy. And um, one thing I noticed is that you leave out monitoring and the kind of advocacy that goes along with intergovernmental organization monitoring. Not that I'm arguing that's particularly successful, but sometimes that's the kind of monitoring that at least is there during highly repressive periods when there's not, um, when connections with domestic activists are not particularly strong, and they can't be strong. And of course, this varies by country. So those are the first questions I like to pose, and I think there's other things to talk about with regard to norms and how law works and stuff like that. But I really thought it was unique and original to try to think about when it is that law can be part of a calculus. So I'm glad to see you working on that.
Great, thank you very much, Ann. Jan?
Okay, well, first off, thanks very much, Ann, and nice to meet you.
Yeah, same here.
A few quick responses. Yeah, I think you're right that in practice, you know, sometimes it's hard to think about what these individuals as doing as being rational in the way that we often use rational sort of in everyday speak, because they're so firmly embedded in an ideology. And in a sense, we do deal with that, and in a sense, we don't. The sense in which we don't is that we would consider that, in terms of our model, a form of rationality, in the sense that because they have some ideology, they get some utility from doing, let's say, a higher utility from doing something than if they didn't have the ideology. So in a sense, that kind of thing is in the model, in the sense that the agents potentially get a benefit from repression.
Right.
And that benefit can come from the regime, but it can also just be an internal benefit. I really like doing this, or I really think this is the right thing to do. So in that sense, it's in the model. What I think we could do a better job of in the paper is just being more explicit about that, and recognizing there's some things about ideology we can deal with and some we can't.
Yeah, I figured that's what you'd say, and that's how I would answer it too. But at the same time, in the paper, I think you'll probably speak to some of our colleagues more effectively if you're able to, you know, put that distance in there to say, here's how we're modeling these kinds of issues, and so all kinds of things could go into that sort of rationality part. And you know, I think the paper is really well written, and in many cases, you do a really good job of that. But so that's just a follow-up.
The other thing I would say about ideology is that I think one of the implications of our model is that leaders ex ante have an incentive to recruit a set of agents who share a particular ideology, who aren't in some ways they might share an ideology with the leader and have a different ideology from the people they might potentially be asked to repress. And again, the way that would play out is they would have this larger B term in the model. I agree with you on the second point that the model depends on a very specific concept of a repressive period. So this is not intended to be a model of all repression and all protest, but it is specific to what we borrow from Jon Berlin, what we call the endgame scenario, which is a situation in which basically the leader has two choices. In order to stay in office, he or she has to repress. And has to have the agents follow the orders to repress. And if they don't, he's out. And if he doesn't order repression, he's out. And that happens. There are actually many situations in which that occurs. So I think we just need to be clear in the paper that that's the scope where we think this mechanism is likely to be most relevant. It may be relevant in other situations, smaller scale situations, but this is the type of situation in which we think it's the most relevant, or most likely to be relevant.
Thanks.
The third question, do we intend to test the model? Actually, the answer is no, and for the following reason. You know, that this isn't the kind of model that I think allows us to generate a testable hypothesis. What we're trying to do with this model is suggest that there's a third type of mechanism for constraining repression, a third type of mechanism by which law and norms could constrain repression, in addition to logic of consequences and logic of appropriateness, this logic of expectations. We don't really make a specific prediction. I think we tried to be very explicit in the paper to say this doesn't always work. This can work under certain conditions. It doesn't always work. For testing it, you know, I've thought about this quite a bit, and I just don't know what we would do because, you know, one suggestion we've had is, well, you know, talk to these individual agents after the fact if they decide to follow the order, if they decide not to follow the order. And part of the problem is I think there's going to be a lot of bias in what they say, because I think there's going to be a normative bias towards saying I didn't shoot because it was the wrong thing to do, even if that's not why they didn't shoot. Right? So if a leader, the leader also, in the case of a leader who decides not to order repression and step down peacefully, what that leader is going to say afterward is, I decided to step down peacefully because I'm opposed to violence, etc., etc. And that might be true, but if he decided to step down peacefully because he didn't expect to be able to stay in power, I think he would most likely also still say that. So it's a little hard to tease this out, and it's also, I think, you know, it's very hard after the fact to get these kinds of security agents, military or police, to say, well, I didn't shoot because I didn't expect the other guys to shoot. And that doesn't, and the fact that they wouldn't say it, I think, doesn't necessarily mean that that's not part of what was happening now. This becomes a very difficult thing for me to think about testing empirically. Of course, if anyone has any ideas, of course, I'd love to hear them. But the reason I'm comfortable, and I'm usually not, the reason I'm comfortable in this case proposing a theory without a detailed empirical test is that that what we're trying to do with this theory is suggest a mechanism, just this theoretical mechanism that could constrain repression in ways we haven't quite thought of. On the last point, I'll keep this one brief. Very well taken point that we need to talk more about the monitoring literature. In fact, more generally speaking, in the next version that we're already working on, that I emailed you all about the other day, we're adding a much more detailed discussion of the advocacy literature. Because I do think that this mechanism has some impacts for the some implications for the conduct of advocacy.
Thanks.
Okay. We've got Ryan on a two-finger, myself, and Amanda, and the queue is open. So at any time anybody wants to jump in, just pop up the relevant fingers. Ryan, and I've got Ann and then Keith.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I popped up my hand and had a two-finger. It turns out I have two of them. So so Ann started off with good stuff because it was stuff that I was going to bring up. So to the question about the end game, I think that point is well taken, that this is a certain situation in which if the leader does not repress, that that he or she is out, right? I understand that correctly. But in the model, the utility of the leader for not repressing, U sub L, you know, the slash through the R, is 0. And it seems to me that that should vary, and it sometimes should be negative. Or in some way we should deal with the fact that sometimes leaders get to step down peacefully, and that is oftentimes when they have assurances from other governments that they have places to go. But other times they get killed. And so we get into the situation in which if you don't repress, it's worse than 0, right? It's you're dead, not you lost office. And so that should enhance your desire to repress, or gamble for survival, or gamble for whatever these things may be. And then probably a point that you're more interested in is, and this is about this distinct mechanism. And so I really like where this is going, and I believe it's probably there, but I wasn't all the way convinced necessarily that this is a distinct mechanism. Instead, isn't this just a mechanism maybe influencing Delta in some way, right? So we have agents that now either care about norms or care about consequences later on, not short-term consequences. So now we have agents that are not worried not worried about being legally prosecuted or something in the short term, but now I have to think way into the long term. And to me, that's just those two mechanisms working, but in the distant future rather than right now. And so I was going to see if you could speak to those two things.
Okay, thanks very much, Ryan. Two very good points. I think you're right that in practice there can be negative utility, of course, from stepping down from power. So I'll check on that. I think at the end of the day, if we model it that way, it doesn't really change the key result for us. Remember, the key result for us is a very simple point, which is, under certain conditions, there are multiple equilibria for the agent. That's really the key. That's the claim we're making. And because there's multiple equilibria for the agents, it matters whether or not respect for human rights is focal or not, in terms of choosing between those equilibria. On the second point, obviously we need to clarify this in the paper. Here's why I think it's a distinct mechanism. Because what we're saying is that under certain conditions, what matters, if I'm the guy with the gun, is not whether I think I'll be punished for shooting, and not whether I've internalized a norm against doing so, but whether I think the guy next to me, who's also holding a gun, thinks he'll be punished for shooting. And whether the guy next to me, whether I think the guy next to me has internalized a norm against it. Right? And I think that has important implications, because what it means is that it makes this social conflict for creating focal points really, really important. And in terms of advocacy, part of what it means is not just advocating to say, you shouldn't shoot. That's important. But what might also be important is a form of advocacy that makes people think that other people think it's wrong to shoot. And that's a slightly different strategy. And the latter, in my reading of the advocacy literature, and I welcome feedback from those of you here who know it much better than I do, I don't see a lot of that. And maybe there's good reason for that, but I'd be interested in hearing it.
All right. Okay. So on the two fingers we have myself, Amanda, Ann, and Keith, and then we've got Keith and Amanda on one finger. So two things I want to raise along this lines of the scope conditions and endgame scenario, and one of which is an empirical implication, I think, that falls out, and I'm thinking now of Sickink's justice cascade, is that the strategy changes, right? So I think Brian has a nice point. I mean, we can set 0 at any value we want to, right? So, but I think the key thing to Ryan's point is that there's potential variance, and that leaders have different expectations, and you're ignoring the possibility of accident. But one of the things that the justice cascade produces is a reduced expectation on accident. And so that's certainly not anything for your current paper, because it's kind of a side point, but it's an interesting thing that until Ryan said it, I hadn't thought about. And tying that to this third mechanism that you're talking about might be interesting for other people to do down the road. But to the whole endgame scenario, I want to push you guys on this, because you're absolutely right, and just for the group, I don't think you should bring this into your paper, but those of you who remember when John Kerry was running for the Democratic nomination, one of the standard stories was that they would do all these interviews with people that were like, well, I'm not really in love with John Kerry, but I think he's the only one that can win. Right? And so there was this story, and that's exactly the mechanism these guys are talking about. There was a story out there that, it's like, well, I don't necessarily have a problem shooting the protesters, but I'm pretty sure nobody else wants to shoot them, so I'd better not either. Right? It's like, I don't want to vote for John Kerry, but everybody else is gonna, so I need to. So you guys have picked an end point. Right on a continuum. There's a 0 to 1 continuum where, it's a 0 to infinity actually, right? Which is how many people do I need to rely on as the leader to successfully repress? And your point, though, you don't actually model it this way, or at least I didn't understand it to be in the model. If it is that as we move from 0 toward infinity, the coordination problem kicks in. It's going to kick in at some, and exactly where that threshold is, Lord only knows, right? But that's part of why we do these sorts of models, because we don't need to worry about exactly where the threshold is. And to me, that's actually what the model you developed is about. I don't see you actually talking at all about that threshold, or I don't see you having a binary, right? Which is conceptually that's how you talk about it, and verbally that's how you talk about it. There's no binary in the model where the leader either can rely on a very small group and there is no coordination game that results because they can all communicate with one another, or they're the leaders in another world where the leader needs to rely on a super large number of people. And so I want to encourage you to think about, I can see a particular pushback coming from a referee or reader saying, well, endgame scenarios, sure, they're important, but they're not that common. And as Anne pointed out earlier, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's happened prior to the end game. And when we don't bother to model that whole bunch of stuff, it's very plausible that there's structural constraints in place. So it seems to me that you're going to be better. I guess I just don't. I'm not understanding the. No, let me put it this way. I think the trade-off in making it less general, placing these scope conditions that you've placed around it, aren't worth it. I don't think your model is actually doing that, and I think you've got a much more general story that you can tell, which is quite interesting and is going to apply to empirically a much larger world.
Okay. Well, thanks, Will. So a couple quick responses. I agree about the justice cascade point, the reduced expectation on exiting. I'll have to think about it, whether we should model it the way that Ryan suggested as well. It also ties, and we mentioned it briefly, but we should say more to this work that Dan Krukmarek is doing about the ICC, and how essentially once a leader has selected into mass violence, the presence of the ICC makes them want to continue that violence and fight to the last man because their exit option is no longer very good. So we'll put that in there in some way. One thing I want to emphasize is, in terms of things like the justice cascade, part of what we're trying to do with this model is actually emphasize the importance of that. Somebody I know who read it called it game theory for constructivists, because, which is ironic, of course.
I had that thought too, actually.
So on the one hand, it's a game theory model, which is not exactly the mainstay of constructivist work. On the other hand, what we're trying to show with the model is just how important things like culture and advocacy are, because that's what's going to determine how the coordination game is solved, right? It's not going to be solved based on rational things that we can model. On the second point, I have to think about this more. Our instinct going in was, let's put scope conditions on it where we're most confident this mechanism's likely to play out. But as you say, they're not actually in the model. The model can apply to anything. So one approach could be to say, we think that this model most closely approximates reality in this particular situation, but of course there's a continuum, and in other situations it might be less of a close approximation than others, depending on the strength of the PA problem that the leader has. If he needs 5 guys who he's known all of his life to go out and repress, then this doesn't come up, right? But if it's 500,000, then it's more likely to. So we need to think a little more about how to do that.
Okay, Amanda.
All right, so my two-finger question doesn't seem like a two-finger question anymore. But I'll still give it. Jan, you mentioned that human rights law is not going to be the next frame, but it's going to be more advocacy overall, which I think is a great idea. I would even push you to say this could be the first big paper on human rights education, especially human rights education in the military sense. And so what you're really saying through this cost term is that, look, you as the soldier think that someone in your group is going to be or has been persuaded that there's possible costs for doing this. And how are they persuaded by this idea of this norm is really through human rights education. And so I wonder actually if one testable hypothesis that comes out of this is that if there's human rights education in some sort of military training, that a dictator's shelf life is going to go down because they're not going to be able to carry out any sort of endgame scenario. So I really like this idea of the new frame, because my real problem when I read through this the first time was that, how do we know that these people actually know about the law, and how are they persuaded that this law is actually going to come after them after the fact?
Thanks, Amanda. I really like that idea about human rights education. That's a really good idea. I think I'll talk to my co-author. We'll see how we can work that in. One thing I want to mention, and I'm glad you like the suggested reframing. Is one of the interesting things about the model is it doesn't matter how big the C term is, as long as it's not 0. You get the coordination problem either way, right? So you have a big C term, you have a small C term, you still have a coordination problem. So what's going to matter in determining where we end up in terms of equilibrium are things that are not in the model. Right? So like you said, human rights education, that's where I think we can talk about the importance of that. And one of the things I find interesting in the advocacy literature, maybe you guys know better than I do, a lot of advocacy to the military and to the police and things like that. Most of the case studies that I've read in the advocacy literature have been about advocacy toward other groups. And partly, of course, that could be because ex ante, the leader has an incentive to prevent this. He doesn't want Amnesty International advocating respect for human rights to his military, right? Because he wants to keep that option open. But I'd be interested if anybody knows of important cases where there's been sort of targeted campaigns toward regime agents or things like human rights education. Examples of that would be really helpful.
Yeah, Amanda? And then we've got Ann.
Yeah, so I would actually look at this human rights education stuff, and especially human rights education of militaries. And so it might be just a form of military support and aid that's given, especially from the United States, with this idea that let's support humanitarian law being taught more generally than human rights. And then my second question about the C term, or this was my actual question, could the C term could this not have to do with human rights norms at all, but just have to do with something like your expectation that you or your buddy could lose their job under the new regime? And so you're not going to carry this out for nothing to do with human rights or expectations about some sort of legal battle you could be in, but just that the next guy could not want to hire you if you participated.
Yes. So the way we thought about it is this C term could come from anywhere. It could come from a logic of consequences, sort of flow from law. It could flow from norms in the sense that I bear. It is really hard for me to do something because I've internalized the norm, or it could be something else. And this is part of why we want to reframe the paper, because that term doesn't necessarily have to come from law. It could come from law, right? And advocacy around the law could help create a focal point that solves that coordination game, but it doesn't have to be law, right? The broader point is that when you end up in this coordination game, the logic of expectations is a mechanism that might constrain repression, but it could come from many sources. That's why we're moving toward that new frame.
Okay, Anne.
Yeah, I realize I'm confused about what a 1 versus 2 finger question is. But could I just ask, what exactly is the reframing we're talking about at the moment before I ask my question?
Let me answer that. So a lot of the early feedback we got on this paper was similar to some of the things Amanda's saying today and others are saying, which is, is this really about law? And I think I personally, sort of, given the work I've done, wanted to make it about law, but in the end, it's really about more than law. It's about constraints on repression. And so the reframing we're going to do is essentially framing it around mechanisms for constraining repression. And we have, broadly speaking, 2 sets of them out there, the appropriateness ones and the consequences ones. And what we're going to essentially say that our contribution here is to say that in a particular type of scenario, there's a third mechanism that could be important, which is the logic of expectations. And to the extent that mechanism is important, it implies that things like advocacy and culture and education matter in ways that are not just picked up by the logic of consequences and appropriateness. So advocacy can matter in ways other than changing norms, naming and shaming, etc. It matters in those ways, but it could also matter in this other way, that it creates a focal point that helps that essentially steers the agent toward one solution versus another in this coordination game. And so we were going to change the title. Let me give you the new title we're thinking about, because I think the title matters, right? Collective action and constraints on repression at the end game. That's what we're thinking of as the new title, so that it's not about law specifically. Speaking of framing things.
Okay. Well, then here, my original comment that I wanted to make is I think it's very important at least to suggest observable causal mechanisms. I mean, to suggest what causal mechanisms might be observed to at least bolster the general logic of the model. The logic of these expectations makes a lot of sense to me, and bizarre as it might sound, I mean, I was sort of thinking about this when I was working on diplomacy of conscience, but like I knew I was not the person to do a formal model of how amnesty works, but I think their logic of writing directly to officials through urgent action, that kind of thing, it really is about trying to get people to realize that somebody's watching, and it's only a short extension to say, other people are probably thinking about this human rights issue too, and the way that law works when you're looking at sort of a communicative action frame is kind of like that. People start to realize not just, oh, it's not appropriate, but if I do it, I'm going to stick. I mean, there's definitely a social part of it, and that's probably why somebody thought it was game theory for constructivists. So it would be real interesting to try to get a little bit more clarity on what the distinctive thing is about the logic of expectations, and it's conceivable it could apply to law, but possibly, I'm not sure, other things, I don't know. But I'd almost favor starting with a focused model and then thinking about how it could be expanded. Just some ideas.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I think we need to say more about what the logic of expectations is and what some of the observable implications would be.
Yes.
Because there are observable implications. A lot of the ones we've been thinking about are observable implications in terms of what these leaders would do ex ante, in terms of how they select their agents. We touched on that a little bit, right? You want to select agents that are going to expect the other agents to shoot no matter what. You want to select agents that come from a different culture, maybe, than the people they're being told to shoot. And not just because of ideological or sort of other social reasons, but they just don't have that same common knowledge that the people they're being told to shoot have. So we can definitely say more about this. It's a good suggestion. Thank you.
So next up I have Keith. Let me just sneak in. Jan, apparently Lyle has a new data set on the construction of forces, and this is more in armed conflict settings, but right, it's the force behind the force that ensures that the people actually shoot, because they'll come in and shoot the shooters if the shooters aren't shooting. As ridiculous as that sounds, hopefully that makes sense.
So as you were describing a little bit ago, your sort of description of why this is a distinct mechanism from other mechanisms, you talk a lot about the logic of expectations and my expectations about what the guy next to me is going to do. And that certainly comes across in the paper, but that's not how I viewed your contribution. In fact, the logic of expectations thing to me is just like, okay, that's a description of Nash equilibrium. That's just what it is. So the way I see this as a different mechanism is that you can say, imagine a law, like an international law or just a norm, maybe, that doesn't really do anything. So you can think of a law that doesn't change anyone's payoff. It doesn't increase the expected cost. It doesn't decrease the expected benefit. So it appears to be so. In the debate over this law, people would like scream about it not having any enforcement or any teeth in any way. So how could a law like that have an effect? And the way it can have an effect is that without changing anyone's payoff, it just announces we're going to play this equilibrium instead of this equilibrium. And so, like the McAdams paper and book which you cite has a lot of colorful examples of laws about which side of the road that we're going to drive on, and the fact is people have an incentive to coordinate, so you don't have to shoot people for driving on the wrong side of the road or make them feel bad about driving on the wrong side of the road. They have an incentive to not run into each other. So when you announce an equilibrium, they're happy to play that one. And so that's what I see as, especially if you want it to be a paper about law, which seems like that's in question. Like that's what I saw as what's different about this than other mechanisms, more than just the statement that people's actions depend on what they think other people are going to do. That's it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's an interesting point, Keith. And I guess not entirely a surprising one coming from a game theorist, because for you this sort of logic of expectations thing is very intuitive. So let me put it this way. I think the way it's a very specific sort of logic of expectations that we're arguing about here, in the sense that this mechanism, it doesn't depend on the extent to which that particular individual is subject to a logic of consequences over appropriate. It just, like I said before, it depends on the extent to which they think other people are, and that point, although in some contexts it's old, I think that point has been overlooked in the literature on most of the literature, at least to my knowledge, on repression and on human rights law. We are focusing on, on the individual, right? On punishing that individual and making that person fear a punishment, or ex ante deterring them, or changing their preferences through some normative or legitimizing mechanism. So I think in the grand scheme of things, you're right that it's not this new mechanism, but it's one that I think hasn't been really thought about much in this particular context. I think we should be more specific about that, though.
Yeah, Jan and Brian's next on a 2-finger, and then we've got Keith and Amanda on 1-fingers. And let me just say, right, so this is always this challenge of like, who the heck is my audience? Who am I writing to? Because I'll be honest with you, I read the abstract and was like, oh, wow, why haven't I thought of it? This is awesome. Like, I completely got it. Learned almost nothing after the abstract. But you know, I'm hardly your average reader, but it's one of the more interesting things I've read in the past couple of years in terms of like, I learned a lot in that abstract because I had never thought of it in those terms. I'm like, why haven't I thought about this? Yeah, that's cool. I really like that. But then it was just unpacking what, you know, and part of that's also a credit to how nicely you draft, you know, I mean, how well the abstract works and the introduction as well just unpacks that greatly. But and so that's a challenging thing, right? To keep, it's like, well, yeah, we know that's Nash equilibrium, but tons of other people that's not even, you know, because they're not reading in the same way. And so I don't have any idea what the solution to that is. Ryan.
Yeah, just a real quick 2-finger. At some point in the discussion about education, which I think is a really awesome point, Jan asked if anyone knew about some of these education, some of the education, and I would point out that national human rights institutions, the stuff that I've been working on, they release annual reports, and some of them more or less say, we educated we educate. And then some will go as far as to say, we educated this precinct on November 3rd. I mean, so you get a huge variance over how much information you're going to get about that education, but there is some information out there as to what agents are educating. And they bring up some really interesting things to go forward as well, because they're sort of an endogenous actor. So you can problematize that as long as you want, because that's the state creating an institution that's going to then educate its own agents. So, you know, have fun with that. But there is some stuff out there that you know, tells when agents are being educated.
Yeah, and Jan, if you check I put in a paper by Rachel Wall called "Policing Values and Violence: Human Rights Education with Law Enforcers in India," and just very quickly, what she finds in there is that it's a great, wonderfully cynical piece if you like cynicism, right? Because what she finds is that chapter and verse, the police in India who go through this training understand international human rights law. Yet, every one of them, when then asked, well, you know, how does it apply to criminals and terrorists, say, oh, well, criminals and terrorists aren't human. And so torture is obviously appropriate. And then when you look at public opinion polls, right? So Amnesty did a public opinion poll and found that 74% of the Indian population agreed that torture was appropriate for keeping the public safe. And so all the police are doing is reflecting public opinion, which would go, you know, so in that setting, what's everybody's expectation going to be? Well, that they're going to repress, and so that's going to have a different focal solution. But I take a look at that piece as well as, and that'll also cue you into a lot of other work. Keith.
So speaking of coordination problems, this should have been probably a 2-finger question related to like the first thing that Anne said, but I'm still going to say it. I guess it's related to 2 things that Anne said. First, I mean, you started out saying that we don't want to test this model, and we talked about observable implications a little bit, but you know, I hope you stick to like not talking too much about observable implications and insisting on this being sort of a not a model that is sort of apply this to data sort of model. I think it's a normative paper and ought to be. But the other thing was about rationality, and sort of, you mentioned one answer, which I think is a good answer, that to some extent we can think of ideological concerns as being part of the B function, these benefits that they get from effort. But another thing I just wanted to throw out there is that like, I think it's still a paper that I would want to read if you stipulated that the assumptions of the model were completely unrealistic and these people were not rational at all. And the reason is that I see it as a normative paper about the sort of possible ways for institutions like international law to have an effect. And so for a paper like that, I do kind of want to know how the law works in a system of rational agents, because if you get a bunch of repression in a system with not rational agents, then I don't know what to say about the effects of institutions. Should we adopt some legal remedy, or should we re-educate people to consider the consequences of their actions, or sort of behave more rationally? So I mean, I think as a normative paper, that there's a reason to focus on like the kind of model that you're looking at. That's it.
Thanks, everyone. Let me just say a couple quick things. Well, I'll say, well, to Ryan, you can expect an email from me shortly after this workshop asking you for if you happen to know of any specific examples from NHRI reports that I can put in the paper. And on what several of you have pointed out, part of what we've struggled with, and I'd love your feedback on this, is who's our audience here? Because on the one hand, the theory's a formal theory. On the other hand, I think for formal theorists, for a lot of formal theorists, I'm not sure how surprising it is that it's a coordination problem. There's even a sub-community, from what I understand, of the formal theorists that don't like games with multiple equilibria because you don't have a clear expectation of what the equilibrium is. So my approach, our approach, has been to try to make this appealing largely to non-formal theorists, to people like Amanda and Anne and Ryan, and to some extent Will, who are not pure formal theorists, but other people who study human rights, other people who study law, other people who study repression, and that's why. And let me know if you thought this was the case. We tried to write the paper in such a way that you basically didn't have to read, if you weren't inclined toward game theory, you didn't have to read that model in detail to understand the point. Like, we actually wrote out most of the theory informally at first. And there's some benefit, I think, to reading, if one is so inclined to reading the model, because it helps clarify things. But the idea was, let's write this in a way so that someone who's never taken the game theory course can actually get something out of it. On the other hand, what that does is might maybe say, the formal theorists might say, well, why are you doing this? Why do you have this whole section 3 in here if you've got the model? So this is the thing. This is one of the things that we've struggled with, both in terms of making this as good a paper as we can, but also in terms of trying to be successful with the paper. Is who do we pitch it to? And that touches on the things that both Will and Keith raised. I'd love to know what folks think about that.
I've got both Anne and Amanda on 2 fingers. Anne?
May I ask Keith for you to say what you mean by a normative paper, just so I'm clear about that? That's my question.
Yeah, I guess so. When I say normative, I think that I meant this is a paper about, at least the way I saw it, is sort of, in my head, what are the potential welfare effects? So normative in that sense of so like, can laws that say don't change someone's payoff like make people better off? And so I saw the point as that kind of is there a role, normative role for law, as opposed to, in contrast to, how can we use this model to get some I mean, though you do get comparative statics, I mean, to like get something to let us test in a regression or something, what leaders are going to do or what agents are going to do. That's what I meant by normative.
Okay. Well, then doesn't that affect the sort of, I think the question of who the audience is, you know, if you're writing a paper about potential welfare effects and yet there's no observable implication, to me it's like, why should I read it? You know, and I'm not qualified to judge the level of the formalization of the model, but you know, if it's a really well done model, then I think it's got value as simply a paper, but its normative value is going to be the level to which it helps us reformulate ways of understanding the role of law. So I don't think those two things are necessarily in conflict. So I think the paper's pretty, I've already said what I think would make the paper, the things I said I think would make it more approachable, but in terms of scholarship, I don't see those two things as necessarily at odds, although I do understand that, you know, that formal theorists do split these kinds of issues conceptually. So then, you know, the model better be real good and real technologically tight, if that's all you're going to do. But then you diminish, I think, the relevance for the topic.
Go to Amanda next, and let me just sneak in during the transition. It might be interesting for you guys to look at the Roy model, which is because, and this is an economic paper back in the 50s, and the last name is Roy, and it's a completely verbal model, but it's, oh God, now the Nobel economist, the selection effects economist, anybody help me?
Heckman?
Heckman.
Heckman, yes. Heckman formalizes it. Right, and you can read the two, and like almost no one can read Heckman's formalization of the, I mean not almost no one, but it's a very small group of people who can read the, relatively speaking. Most anyone can read the Roy model. And yeah, I could imagine a version of this paper that you try to write for Human Rights Quarterly that has no formalization of any kind. But you're going to...
Don't do that.
You're going to run into some... You're going to run into some challenges if you try and go that route. But for the record, in terms of what you were trying to accomplish, for me as a reader, I think you did it really well. But I don't know that I'm, you know, I worry that I'm a very small section of the readership. Amanda.
Yes. Sure. So Will kind of stole my what I was going to say. What I was going to say has to do with maybe writing a piece of this that is completely non-formal. And maybe you want to send it to a law journal, maybe you want to send it to Human Rights Quarterly. But I think there would be value in getting this idea of logic of expectations really clearly defined for a group of scholars, and really clearly defined as unique from the logic of appropriateness and the logic of consequences. And I think, you know, you could reference the other paper with the model in it for that group of scholars, and, you know, perhaps just really lay out what this logic of expectations is and how this would work in a couple of scenarios. And I think that would be really valuable to the larger human rights readership. I had to do that in my book, so I actually have a, you know, the theory is game theoretic, and the model, the equilibrium, everything just went in a big online appendix. So and that was something that was done for readership.
Okay, and it turns out, Amanda, you're next on a one finger if you still have it. Nope.
Nah, I'll pass.
All right, cool. Did anyone else, before we want to jump in on this issue that Jan raised about framing and so forth, before we move on? Yeah, Anne? And Pete?
I'm sorry to keep jumping in, but I actually think the paper is effective, and when I think about my graduate students, we need good I don't think it should be dumbed down. I mean, I think we need good examples of how game theory can be used about these kinds of issues. So what I would favor would, and if I were a reviewer for pretty much any journal, if I received this, I'd say, you know, put in some more narrative and some more clarification. But I don't see a reason, if you're putting it in a professional journal, why you would have to do, you know, separate it out. And I think the danger, and maybe Amanda could speak to this more, but the danger if you just do a sort of text thing for Human Rights Quarterly is then you really have to give examples, anecdotes, etc., that don't, they bolster the argument a little bit, but it doesn't prove something. And it's difficult, except in an abstract way, to talk about here's what individual agents do and here's how it comes to be a group thing, unless you're using game theory, I think. So I would not want to separate them too much. I think the strength is in using this form of modeling or abstraction to conceptualize the problem. But I do think that detailing logic of expectations would be a good service that this paper could do.
Keith and then Ryan.
Yeah, on this same point about framing, in terms of like these two audiences, I think like I don't think it's a concern that the model is like seen as too simple to the formal theory audience or something like that, because you know, I think that formal theorists I really appreciate like a model that is very simple, almost trivial, but says something important. So I don't think that people are gonna, like, I wouldn't get this paper to review and tell you that it's not hard enough. In fact, I read it and I thought, man, Tiberiu, you wrote down this like very simple model and it says something great, and I'm jealous. But the other thing is, as far as I think for both audiences, but especially for the non-formal theory audience, and especially I think you know, people who haven't read some of the law scholarship that you're citing, or that won't take the time to do it when they see that you're citing it. Like, I think one thing that would help is just it would help to have some anecdotes, especially anecdotes that are, you know, I would think of types of legal changes that would not matter under the other two mechanisms, and would matter under yours, and just like through the entire paper, replace almost every like abstract reference to focal points with a concrete reference to one or two running examples, because I think, like with them, like again with the McAdams paper, what makes that such a great paper is these little examples that we can hold on to, which like about driving on different sides of the road or whatever. I mean, I think that makes people get it. Of course, your example would be a different example, but the abstract statements about focal points are a little bit more. I mean, it's not light reading on some of that areas if you're not used to thinking about those exact terms.
Ryan?
Yeah, I was going to comment about the framing. I was really happy to see your email, Jan, about discussing framing, because that's what I was thinking as I was reading it. So I think there's one of two ways for me that it would work out. And this actually goes back to what a few other people were just saying about anecdotes. When I was reading the paper before I saw your email about reframing, there were all these really nice examples, like in Russia in the early 1900s, that to me I kept writing in the margins, well, where's IL? And so this paper was about repression and still the agent's beliefs about what other people are going to do, but are they going to repress or not? And that's exactly what your email about framing said. So it's either framing it that way or, like Keith just said, having some really good law examples. Like one of the two probably. So that's just my 2 cents.
Do you want to jump in, Jan, or?
Sure. Yeah, lots of really good suggestions. I don't know how much I have in terms of responses. I really like the idea from Amanda of just having a section in the paper where we just clarify in detail what we mean by logic of expectations and how it differs from the other mechanisms. And I think under the new framing that I suggested in my email the other day, that really is going to be important. So just, before we get into really the theory about endgame scenarios, maybe just have a section that says this is what we think this mechanism is, and this is why it's different. And now we're going to give you a sort of a model of where we think it is likely to play out. I really like that. And I think that's also consistent with Anne's suggestion. Keith, I like that suggestion as well. Just going to have to see if I can find a good example. Because, obviously driving on the right or left side of the road won't work for us. It just and in part because it's been used so many times, but it's also in part because, I think a human rights reader is going to look at that and kind of say, all right, that's not really how shooting people works. But so we need something a little better than that. So yeah, all good suggestions, and thanks Emery for the suggestion on the chat box here. I've met Ryan Goodman before, and I'll send it to him. I don't know if he remembers me, but hopefully he'll comment on it.
Good.
Well, Jan, I'd like to, and the queue is open after, so I've got a 1 finger here, and the queue is open. So other than the fact that I'll be talking, I'll be trying to pay some attention, but I may not be as attentive as I normally am. But feel free to jump in, folks, for the queue. So I'm going to throw a bit of a spanner into the proposed new direction. And that's this. On page 22, when we get to the dual coordination problem section, my reaction was, whoa, where is this coming from? So it wasn't just a trivial thing that you're going to be rewriting anyway. That wasn't well set up from my perspective. But then it felt to me like you're really now opening things up. So it seemed like somebody at some point probably said to you, whoa, there's an endogeneity. We all know that dissidents matter. Why aren't you modeling this? And that, so I felt like, well, okay, we'll go ahead and try to take that on. But in the middle of one of those paragraphs, you say, of course we can't. It's beyond the scope of this paper to do this fully. And my reaction is, well, geez, why are you bringing this up at all? I felt like you've got this really nice story. It's well focused. You're hitting it, and all of a sudden you get to this section and everything gets more complex. It gets more complex verbally, it gets more complex formally. You wave your hands and we can't really do it properly, but we're going to try to illuminate something. So for me, that whole section just did not work. It felt like a half measure, and I felt like it's either needs to be a full measure or just get rid of it. But that just shows you how well I bought everything that happens beforehand. This was one of these papers I was reading where I'm like, oh man, am I going to have any comments? Right. So I was having that strong a positive reaction to that point, And then, so when I saw your email message come across, I went, ooh, if that's the direction you're going to go, you're really embracing this can of worms that I was worried about opening and thinking maybe you're better off just shutting that thing aside and getting it out of here. But as I listen to others and hear a little bit more about why you guys are thinking that, I can see going in that direction. But I could also, I could easily see choosing not to. And then let me just riff a little bit on the limited, vague thinking I've done in terms of empirical implications. It does seem to me that you've already talked about how you already in the paper consider some of the implications, but one of them for me, which is something really interesting that I've never given thought to, and I'll bet if you look around, some people will at least talk about this if they don't explicitly develop it in abstract theoretical terms. Go back to something I said before when we think about, from 0 to infinity, how many other people do I need to rely on to successfully retain office? And so the thing you guys talk about in the paper is the sort of arguments we see out there about I'm gonna appoint people who are family or either first order family or through ethnic relations or other kinds of relations, more extended family. But another one is that you should build slowly, right? In other words, it does seem to imply that that as a leader who's going to have to rely on repression, you're not going to want to. We should rarely see them when they're new in office go to full-out repression, right? And so, where they have to rely on large numbers. In other words, that if you think of the life cycle of a dictator, that they ought to expand slowly, or that those that do are going to be more likely to last in office, or something like this, right? Because, or they're going to take over an apparatus that already has that largely in place, and you think about the transition and the purge that takes place of existing leaders in the agencies of coercion, right? Well, to the extent that you do that, you put yourself at risk to being able to use that because that's going to raise expectations about for the agents whether or not they're going to be able to. Or it's going to reduce the expectation that the other agents will follow if you start removing the apparatus, the head of the apparatus. So it seems to me there's all sorts of potential implications you could run with that you don't need to test, and then it's too bad, Milan Svolik or something wasn't able to join us, because he'd have more to say about those sorts of things. So I don't know that any of those thoughts tell you don't go in this new direction, but I just do want to offer a little pushback and some perspective on how I think this one could work, though going to dual coordination problem, I think, may undermine if you decide to keep the current frame.
Thanks, Will. I'm glad you brought this up because this is actually a point that we kind of went back and forth about whether to include that part in the paper. And one thing I'll clarify, if we go with the new frame, we could do it while keeping the dual coordination part or not. I think we could do it either way. We could do the new frame about constraints on repression without doing the dual coordination game at the end. Because it's, we could just say, well, this is a mechanism that might constrain this repression. So we did go back and forth on including that. In part for some of the concerns you mentioned is we don't have the space to develop it fully. And here's let me explain why in the end we decided to include it, and and I'll tee that up to see whether people think we should or shouldn't. We included it, in my mind, it was for 3 reasons. The first is that there's already a literature out there about coordination for protest. We think protesters, what they're trying to gauge, you don't want to be the only one out there. You're trying to gauge whether other people are going to show up. And that's a coordination game. I mean, sometimes they show up and sometimes they don't. And regimes know this. It's unpredictable. Sometimes, and it's often like some symbol. The guy in Tunisia who burned himself. I mean, that kind of unpredictable thing. Ex post, it's like, oh, of course they showed up, but ex ante, no one expected it. So there's this coordination problem there. And we expected people to say, well, how does this coordination problem among the agents affect the coordination problem among the protesters? But we expected that feedback. And so we included it. The other 2 reasons were to demonstrate, first of all, including coordination among potential protesters does not affect the key result, which is there is still a coordination game among the agents. There's still multiple equilibria, which creates a space for law and advocacy to matter in terms of creating focal points. I mean, that's the key point. And then the second reason is we can show, at least in terms of our formal expectations, that even a small change in the expectation of whether or not the agents will follow the order to repress leads to a big change in the probability of the protesters showing up. And maybe we can make that clearer. Another thing is that although we know that protesters sort of coordinate, have this coordination problem among themselves in terms of whether they expect other protesters to show up, but what our model implies is part of the problem is they're trying to figure out whether they expect the agents to shoot if they're ordered to shoot. So there's like a couple different stages there. So maybe it's too much for the one paper. I'm not sure. I'm honestly not sure at this point whether we should keep it, and I'd love to know what folks think about that.
Okay, we've got Keith on a 1 finger, but he's also got a 2 finger, and Ryan as well. And Anne and Amanda, if you'd also like to weigh in, please do. Keith.
So my thoughts about the dual coordination problem were pretty much in line with Will's, actually. Not because I didn't like that section. I think it's great. I think all the reasons that you say that it's in there are good reasons for you to have done that model. But at the same time, by the time I got to that point in the paper, I felt pretty satisfied with the paper. I had like a very simple story, and I was done. And I felt like you nailed the set, and then you came back on the stage to play Freebird or whatever. So I mean, I think that's a great thing to have done. If people want to know how it affects that kind of game, it's I think almost any result that the first key point is that it doesn't change the predictions of the model that you want it to make. That's a perfect appendix material. But so I like that. But I also just think that the paper is complete and simple and easy to communicate without that in it. I'm just going to save my 1 finger question because I feel like we're going to stay on this subject, and I want to just follow my own advice and cut it short at my 1 point there.
Ryan?
Yeah, perhaps it's become redundant, but I was also going to jump in and say that, honestly, I didn't know your intentions, but that section to me seemed like, oh, I've gotten this feedback, we need to add this model and stick it onto the back of the paper. And like others have said before, I was content before that. Although I would say, as I was reading it, I was like, this is very interesting. Perhaps this is its own thing. Maybe maybe it's not an appendix. Maybe this is its own paper eventually. But it did seem forced onto the back, just for what it's worth.
Anne or Amanda, any comment on that?
No. I would just say I would take it out because I don't think grad students are going to read that far, and you're going to get you're going to get people to to read it and understand it in depth if it's actually a separate paper that draws on this first one.
Okay. Back to Keith for a one finger.
So this was on the subject of this non-legal framing and kind of conversations about broader impacts about culture and so on that this could have. And so, first of all, I think the legal frame is fine, and I totally buy it as a paper about law. But you know, just a neat non-legal idea that came to my mind is the idea of symbols, which you actually mentioned, I think, a minute ago. But so something that I thought about is we could think about why would the Confederate flag reappear in the American South, like into American culture after so many years. And the story people tell is this was elites in the South letting people know that they were willing to use repression to keep down this civil rights movement. And in a way, I think this fits in perfectly with your story. I mean, this was their in the opposite direction, but this was their solution to this coordination problem, that they flew this flag, and it says, listen, what that flag meant is, listen, we're coordinating on the high repression equilibrium. And one could probably think of symbols that went in the opposite direction, but I think it's a application of the logic of your model, possibly.
All right, the queue is, let me just point out that the queue is open. We've only got about 8 minutes left, and so we turn it over to Jan, but if you've got okay, I see Ryan is jumping in.
So it seems like most folks are in agreement about this dual coordination thing, so we'll talk about that. I have to say, it was actually my idea to include it. It wasn't somebody's comment. It was my expectation of somebody's comment. But maybe my expectation was wrong. So maybe we'll move it to an appendix or to a separate paper. And Keith, the idea of symbols, we've been talking about this because one of the implications, I think, of our model is, it kind of shows just how important symbols can be. Because of course symbols are all about salience, and sometimes what happens, what you see in regimes is that they will, in time t-1, the agents that did follow the order to shoot, they're given big medals and made into heroes and made into symbols, so that in time t, they also follow the order to shoot. The other agents follow the order to shoot, so you put these guys up on a pedestal who saved the country from the terrorists, or whatever you want to call the opposition, right? So I think we could play that up in the conclusions about that implication.
Ryan.
I'm just taking advantage of the fact that the queue is open. I have a curiosity. So as I was reading, and this is not a huge indictment on the model or anything like that, and I obviously didn't see where it would make it go. But as I was reading the paper, I couldn't help but think about what would happen if the decision to repress wasn't binary. Because thinking about substitution effects, some of Courtney and Jackie's work, or some things that Chris has kind of highlighted in his 2007 piece, is that every government represses, and we can think of repression from little small things that are less invasive or less physical, right, like spying, all the way up to some large-scale repressions. And even in protest repression, we can think of agents provocateur and all different types of repression. And so I was thinking about if the repression was continuous rather than binary. And since that got stuck in my head, I kept coming back to it as I was reading it, because the agents get to choose on this continuous scale of how much effort they'll put in. So perhaps a leader says, go kill every person you see, and you go and you shoot a guy and you go, see, I did what I could. And so there's this disconnect between effort and how much repression is being asked for. Again, I don't know if that's going to change the model, but since the queue was open, I wanted to see what you'd say about it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, you know, in the real world, that's correct. There's huge continuum, and it's a multidimensional continuum, etc. The reason we modeled it this way is that one in ordering repression, to my mind, represents the amount of repression where the leader can feel comfortable he's going to stay in power. So it sort of goes back to this scope condition of the endgame scenario. It's whatever that amount is, right? That amount that's going to leave me with an assurance that I'll stay in power. Anything less than that, maybe I'll stay in power if they put in less than 100% effort. But that's the amount that I need. So that's why we modeled it that way. It's sort of tied to our scope. You know, I think that, you know, my sense is that if we, and I'll have to talk to my co-author about this, if we were to model it, again, as a continuum, I don't think it would change the key result. It wouldn't change the fact that there are multiple equilibria, you know, as long as the agents move after the leader. So we could maybe talk a little bit about that, well, you know, in practice, of course, these orders aren't binary, but if we modeled it that way, it wouldn't change. We'd still make the same point.
My you know, naive conjecture is that's right, Jan, but where I think it might have value is in terms of exploring empirical richness, right? I think that's the whole value of the you know, the section where you add dissenters, right? So like adding those sorts of complexity can potentially produce a much more rich model, but they're not going to change the original point, right? I don't think, and so that's a question of whether, you know, do you want to just make this one point and move on and leave it to others to run with it, or do you want to you know, add additional richness and depth? I know you've got your own project that you're starting on substitution, and you know, so Ryan's comment perhaps is a window for you to be thinking about in that project. We're basically out of time. Jan, did you want to toss out any one last second poll the crew issue?
We talked about the key things that I was hoping to get everyone's feedback on, and then a few things that a lot of things that I hadn't thought of in advance. So no, I just want to thank everybody for all your very helpful feedback, for doing this today, and if I can ever return the favor to any of you, please feel free to send me something. I'd love to do that.
Wonderful. And let me also thank everyone. Of course, when Christian and I started this, one of the questions we had is, I wonder if people will be willing to, you know, put in and take an hour and a half out of their day at some point, as well as take all the time it takes to read something. And so we're delighted that so many people are willing to do that and make this virtual workshop a reality. So Ann and Amanda and Keith and Ryan, big props to you. We don't, you know, all you get is cost. You don't get any payoff or any benefit at all, other than participating and helping strengthen the community. So thank you very much. And if you like this idea and you know other communities that you think would benefit from virtual workshops, please steal this idea, encourage others to, and run with it, because we hope this is another way that we can all inexpensively interact with one another and improve the communities that we're all part of. So with that, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And everybody have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Good luck with the paper.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.